so let's talk about Native Americans, or the last sort of regional area that we didn't get to in class. So the Northwest Indians were looking at sort of Washington, Oregon, and the reality is the only tribe we're really going to talk about is the Nez Perce. So that's going to be our example of Northwest Indians. But this is a region of America in which fishing is going to be very, very, very prominent. Specifically like salmon. So you have, if you don't know anything about salmon, salmon like swim upstream and go to spawn or lay their eggs sort of where they were born, and then they go back downstream and they live elsewhere. But so there's an abundance of fishing. Fishing is going to become very significant in that area. As far as the social stratification, the Northwest Indians, and they obviously weren't the only ones, or hopefully you realize that they're not the only ones. We're talking in broad generalizations here. But they did have a social stratification that would, I guess, best be described as, maybe medieval in terms of white history in a way that you might be able to make some sort of comparison. So essentially what you had is you had some sort of elite controlling group that would be like your feudal lord, and then there were community members, right? So your chief is your sort of feudal lord. You have community members, and then you had slaves as well, and slaves would have been at the very bottom of that social stratus in terms of opportunity movement, things like that. But it's very much something that if you're born into it, that's where you are. And so more so than some other Native American tribes, there's a sort of authoritarian hierarchy that exists. A little less communal than some of the other tribes or regions that we talked about, and instead more rigid in terms of their societal structure. The slaves themselves, the reality is it's sort of similar to most slavery in most places. Not that slavery is ever good, but the horrificness of slavery is really largely dependent upon whom your master is. So some were treated relatively well. Some might have even been treated as sort of extended family, whereas others were, beaten and all kinds of negative, enduring negative treatment. There were instances in which slaves could sort of work their way out of that stratus if they were able to marry somebody that was above them, for instance. That could make a difference. If they also had some sort of unusual talent, if they were very, very good at something that was deemed worthy by the culture, that might afford them the opportunity to escape their social situation. There's a lot of waterways up in the Northeast, the Pacific Northwest. So there's a bunch of rivers. There's a significant amount of water transportation through there. So canoes, and even longboats, which were capable of holding 30 or more Native Americans, were a part of the way of life up there. All right. So the Nez Perce are the one example that we'll talk about. They were actually encountered by Lewis and Clark on their expedition. Those were the guys that set off in 1803 after the Louisiana Purchase. Nez Perce is actually translated from, I think it's French, which stands for Pierce Nose. Interestingly enough, the Nez Perce tribe did not have body modifications of that nature. That was the Chinook people. The Nez Perce subsided predominantly on dried fish. Again, this is why fishing is so important. So you can dry the fish, smoke it, and it's capable of being good for an extended period of time. Horses are a little less significant, although again, once the introduction of horses has occurred in the New World, they do aid in the Native American way of life because horses are a much, much better beast of burden than dogs, which we talked about before. It's what some Native American tribes had used prior to the arrival of horses, right? So the Nez Perce, a lot of the people up there would again the communal aspect of it, right, and how they're living, is really what I went over in the last slide, right? But it's the idea of that rigid structure you would have, again, like in a feudal system, right? You have like the lord that has their castle, and then these subservient peoples. I mean, in Russia they call them serfs that sort of surround it. Very similar with the Nez Perce. I do want to call, not on here, but I do want to call your attention to at least one aspect of Northwest Indian culture. And so you may know what a totem pole is. That's something that has at times been significant in popular culture. But a totem pole is a Native American work of art. And it has some religious and cultural significance. But this is more the region of the New World where totems and totem poles are a little bit more, excuse me, prominent or part of the culture. All right. And then Chief Joseph of the Nez Perce is sort of famous. The Nez Perce were in like the western Montana, Idaho area. Chief Joseph was able to hold off 5,000 troops with just 250 warriors. Again, we talked about that guerrilla warfare style. That's sort of how they're fighting. And so it's that hit and run tactic. It decreases his casualties. He's able to hold off white people for a long time. And then finally just sort of realizes that white folk at this point are fighting what's called a war of attrition, which means that they're just going to keep coming and coming and coming, and there's far more white folk than there are natives at this point. And so Chief Joseph decides, like, I'm done. We're not going to fight anymore. They sort of accept their fate, and they're relegated toward that reservation type lifestyle. Some generalizations for all regions then of Native American life. Religion is a significant portion of most cultures. That's true of Native Americans as well. They had shamans. So shamanism is a spiritual belief system that's really a nature-based sort of idea. It's very in tune with nature. And most Native Americans had some sort of religious shaman, religious leader within their tribe that would be responsible for the sort of general spiritual welfare of the tribe. They would be the ones to commune with great spirits. There's a fairly common belief amongst Native American tribes in sort of other realities or other worlds. And the ability of the spirit to sort of cross over. I know we talked about the buffalo. The porcupine is another good example of sort of the ingenuity of Native Americans, right? So they would use the quills from porcupines. Those are the little spikes for things like hairbrushes or other tools. The porcupine quills are almost like needles, and so you could use them to aid in sewing or weaving or things like that. But again, Native Americans were able to utilize the resources that were readily available, which is obviously pretty much what, or hopefully you realize, which is pretty much what all cultures do. When white folk arrive, the comparison civilization-wise, they're not the same. The Europeans and natives are very different in terms of how they live. And we talked about that. The tribes, some of the tribes are actually thoroughly impressed by the efficiency of white folk, their ability to sort of commercially grow food. But there's a vast disconnect in terms of lifestyles and how to live and how to use things. And so ultimately what ends up happening in Native American history is natives basically get pushed out onto reservations. And so during the 20th century, the 19th century and 20th century, the reservation system is established in the United States. Most Native Americans get pushed out onto it. Reservations are a little weird, so they're overseen by the Bureau of Indian Affairs, which is a federal bureaucratic agency. Therefore, reservation land in Cherokee land in the state of North Carolina or Seminole land in the state of Florida are not subject to the laws and jurisdictions of the state. So if you have ever seen Yellowstone, the TV show that got wildly popular a couple of years ago, you see that there's a Native American chief that's running their reservation, and then they have their own police. And so the jurisdictions of local government is not the same as it pertains to tribal land. And so they have a fair amount of autonomy there. It's also one of the reasons why you have Indian casinos on a lot of Native American tribes, even in places where games of chance are still illegal by state law. A lot of the big cities that we have in the United States today actually started out as Native American trading posts, right? Whether that be Pittsburgh, Kansas City, Detroit, Chicago. Hopefully you realize that a lot of those, if you don't know anything about geography, a lot of them are also on major rivers, right? So Kansas City's on the Mississippi. Pittsburgh is actually the Ohio River. Well, the Ohio River is what comes out of Pittsburgh. There's two different rivers that sort of go into Pittsburgh to make the Ohio River. The Ohio then eventually flows into the Mississippi. Chicago is on, I think it's Lake Michigan. Detroit is on a lake. But these are what start out as smaller trading posts and then grow over the course of time. And then this brings us to sort of Indian removal, which actually probably should have been before that, as it's a part of the reservation system. They're continually kicked off their land. There's treaties and negotiations done by white government, by the American government, that are frequently not upheld, or they're then renegotiated. But tribes are essentially removed over and over again to fit white need or desire, right? And then that brings us to the Dawes-Silverity Act. And I know that the date here is outside the scope of this class, right? Because it's 1887. But you'll be tested on this. And so I want to make sure that you're clear as to what the Dawes-Silverity Act is. It's basically the idea or the concept of taking Native Americans off of the reservation system, and they were sent to boarding schools, essentially, where they were taught how to be white. They were given a white name. Christianity was sort of forced upon them. And so at a very young age, these kids would have been taken off the reservation 6, 7, 8 years old, sent to these boarding schools. They would have lived in the boarding school for, say 6, 7, 10 years, and then sent back to the reservation. And at that point, they they've sort of lost their Native American culture. They come back to the reservation. They're outsiders. They're shunned. As you notice in the picture, that's actually the same person. You sort of notice in the picture, the left is a Native American. They spend a lot more time outdoors. Fun, sort of interesting fact, because people like lay out and intentionally tan today. Centuries ago, if you were tan, that was actually a negative thing. Like, you wanted to be as untan, as pale as possible, because it was a status symbol. It meant that you weren't outside all the time, and you weren't sort of engaged in manual labor. But you'll also notice that his hair was cut. That's actually really significant in Native American culture. And I don't know if scalping is a part of this concept, but I do know, and this is actually this still holds true today. Native Americans will cut their hair really as a part of grieving or loss. Native American warriors in the 17th, 18th, 19th centuries, they would only cut their hair if they were defeated in battle. And so having short hair as a Native American is actually a negative thing. It means that you were either defeated in battle or you were in some sort of mourning period. Life has not been good to you. There's a lot of negatives associated with that. Well, obviously in white culture, men keep their hair very short, and so you would see these people then come back, and they just didn't fit into Native American culture anymore, and so it's one of those things that, and the term is called assimilation, right? Like that's a sort of vocabulary word you need to understand. The idea is to try to take Native Americans and assimilate them to white culture, which means get them to adopt white practices, white ways of life, white religion, things like that. But the problem is you do that to these kids, and we did it to kids, and then you send them back to the reservation where Native culture is still predominant. I mean, these were kids that would go back to the Native American reservation where they came from, and after 8 or 10 years, they've almost forgotten their original language because it wasn't permitted in these boarding schools. They would have been like whipped or beaten for speaking in their native tongue. Instead, they were required to speak English. Right. So that's our basic overview of Native Americans. Hopefully that helped. And then the other two aspects of this, we're going to look at specific conflicts, sort of pre-19th century and then 19th century conflicts. All right, thanks.